welcome to our program today, Finding Forgotten Civil War Soldiers and Markers at Cedar Creek and Other Places. We're happy to have you here today to be with us, and I did want to make one announcement before I forget. The sanctuary, if anyone's interested in seeing the sanctuary at Grace, it'll be open after the program is over, okay? I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Mike Kehoe. A lot of you all may know Mike, but I'd just like to say a few words about him. Mike grew up on a farm on the opposite side of Cedar Creek from Fort Bowman and where the Battle of Cedar Creek began. And by the time he was 6 years old, he was finding both Indian and Civil War artifacts on these grounds. Some of his earliest memories were of listening to stories of the Civil War times from his grandparents and neighbors. Mike's family lived in Warren County, had a Middletown address, and a Shenandoah County phone number. That's pretty interesting. He attended and graduated from school in Strasburg and attended VCU in Richmond. In 1981, he was employed by the town of Stevens City as town administrator and later as town manager until he retired in 2015. Mike has always had an inherent interest in local history and volunteered and served with many organizations of that nature over the years, including the Newtown Heritage Festival Committee for 25 years, Cedar Creek Battlefield Foundation for 20 years, and the Archaeological Society of Virginia since he was 14 years old. He's also been with other civic and historic organizations for shorter periods. In his retirement years, he has continued to stay busy assisting professional archaeologists wherever opportunity and time allowed, as well as volunteering with the National Park Service and the Cedar Creek Belle Grove National Park and the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation. Mike currently serves on the board of directors for the Stonehouse Foundation in Stevens City. His passion has evolved from being a collector to conducting research of the Civil War period and earlier times, having spent much of the past winter researching deed records of the early Cedar Creek and North Fork River lands. Recently, he was able to recreate a plat of the entire 2,500-acre Long Meadows plantation that was lost to history. He's also compiled a long list of the almost 10,000 Civil War soldiers on both sides who became casualties, either killed, wounded, captured, or missing at the Battle of Cedar Creek, as well as other pertinent information about each soldier. This is soon to be published as an addendum to a book that he helped to co-author with Dr. Clarence Gear, and Colonel Joe Whitehorn about the Battle of Cedar Creek from a military and archaeological perspective. This research has led to a number of discoveries about events that occurred during the Civil War and Cedar Creek in particular. But most importantly, Mike would like to mention that in 1974, he married his wife Kathy, and they raised two wonderful daughters. Since 1987, they have lived in Shenandoah County, just across the Cedar Creek from Frederick County line, in another historic area, close to both Frohman and Fry's forts of the early settlement period. We'd like to thank you, Mike, for giving us this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you for coming out. If you can't hear me, please say so, and I will try to speak louder. But she neglected one of my favorite things to do now in retirement since 2015 is napping. I do a lot of napping. So I'm also currently collecting walnuts and hickory nuts and anything else I can find in the woods. But that's what you do in retirement. You enjoy what you can. This very first picture is actually was taken on Shenandoah Valley Battlefield's property land. It's called Thoburn's Redoubt. The picture was taken in 2019 at the 155th anniversary of the Battle of Cedar Creek. And the area, that's probably the first time, it was a living history program put on by the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation. And it's probably the first time soldiers had been in line on that hill since since 1864. I believe that's the 54th Pennsylvania Reenactment Regiment, and a lot of them had ancestors that camped there during the battle and fought there and even died there. So they're on hallowed ground. So we'll go to the next slide. You'll also notice in the background of a signal knob. It's a beautiful view from that position. You see how important that peak is at Signal Knob, which was a signal station. Go ahead. This is a map. I'll zoom in on it a little bit. That was done by George Gillespie in 1873 of the battles of Cedar Creek and Fisher's Hill. And I want to show you about where the areas of these so-called monuments or markers are that I've discovered on the battlefield, and else, and other people are aware of them as well. But just to point them out, we have see if this works, a cluster of known markers. Take a little while.
Do you want to try this?
Right here. Go back, please. Right here is the Ramseur Monument, number 1. Monument, number 2 is the 128th New York Monument, and number 3 is the 8th Vermont Monument. And everybody is aware of those, but I just want to show you the proximity of where they are on the battlefield at Cedar Creek. And Cedar Creek, pretty much battlefields is all this area here. One of the larger battlefields in the entire Civil War, even though they didn't have the numbers that they did at other places like at Chancellorsville, or earlier battles in the War of Manassas was really a small battle. The battlefront was only half mile long for the most part. Anyway, the numbers in red are possible monuments or markers that people are not aware of. I'll be speaking of all 7 of them. I'm not going to speak of number 6 because that's actually in Shenandoah County. It's a Downey property, and it's a John Helms grave site, so we're not going to talk about that today. Now, go ahead. Just a little bit about the Ramseur Monument, which was dedicated in 1920. His daughter, who was just born a few days before the Battle of Cedar Creek, was present there, and she was a school teacher at the time. She died in the around 1930, I believe, 36. But she's sitting right there. But something interesting about this marker, this monument, is that the cannonballs actually came from the Portsmouth Naval Yard, and they're 30-pound cannonballs, and that was not here at the Battle of Cedar Creek. And the pillar itself was a monument, was shipped here from Richmond by somebody who did memorials in Richmond, for the cemeteries there. So that's where the monument came from. The pillar came from Richmond, and the cannonballs came from Portsmouth. Cannonballs were actually removed at one time, I believe sometime in the 1960s. They disappeared, and those are replicas now. This is the old picture, but these are replicas. I'm not certain they're even metal. They were replaced. All right, the 128th New York Regiment Monument is just south of the Ramseur Monument on the west side of Route 11 before you get to the bridges. And it was dedicated in 1907. Now, something interesting about that is the 128th lost about half their numbers that day. They were on picket on the Shenandoah County side of Cedar Creek, and a lot of their men were captured. So, and of course, then about half of those died in prison. So even though they didn't lose their lives in the battle, they died in prison, which was probably a worse fate in many cases. picture on the left, we got a little friendly dog over there. I think he either wanted to lick me or chew my leg off, but he was making a racket. Okay, next one. And the 8th Vermont Monument. Most people here have probably been to that. It's on the National Park property. Recent picture, I think the 8th Vermont had rededicated this several years ago, maybe for the 150th anniversary. That picture of a stack of arms is taken in. But on the left-hand side, or the right-hand side, is an old postcard that was taken about, it was postmarked around 1905. And what's interesting about this particular postcard, because I've never seen a picture other than the postcard, and I'll zoom in here a little bit. Is in the back, you can see the monument. See there? That's the monument surrounded by an iron fence. Well, it's all open. It's all open. The picture was taken from where the Park Service headquarters is now, on that knoll on the east side of Route 11. And there's the old road going to the marker. So in the background is the woods where 81 goes through now, and on the right is the old woods. And if you, next time you go down there, you walk the trail to the 8th Vermont Monument, if you look around, you'll notice there's a difference in the ground, and that ground had been cleared. So during the battle, the 8th Vermonters talk about fighting in the woods. So they actually may have fought to the right of where the marker is. They placed the marker where it is now because of the path going to it, and it was visible from Route 11. I'm not certain, but it may be not at the exact location where they fought over the flags with Earl Gordon's men. Okay.
I don't know how to get rid of that on the right.
That way. Just press
I did.
reverse, plus clear. Complicated.
Yeah, I need help.
See something says escape?
Escape's over here, but I'm afraid
Do that,
then
do
will
that.
disappear. Okay, great.
All right, next picture.
Now, okay.
Okay, this is what started all my research, was this marker. Was on Thoburn's Hill where we saw the picture earlier of the troops lined up. It laid at the base of an old cedar tree. It's a marble marker. It's 22 inches long and 11.5 inches wide. And it just laid there at the base of this tree for years and years and years on the hillside. And it says GPM on it, October 19th, 1864, and then the date 1905. Well, the story was that in 1905, a soldier came from up north and brought this marker with him, and he placed it at the tree at the location where he lost his leg. Some of the stories were that he lost his arm there. But anyway, it laid there all those years, at least 50 years, undisturbed. They moved it, the old tree that was originally against, fell down. They moved it to another tree close to it. Eventually, the property, Mrs. Kearns, who was there in 1905, told the story, and I was only 6 years old, told the story about the soldier coming in and in a buggy, and he asked permission to put the marker there on top of the hill where the trenches were. And the property sold in 1967 to the Whittam family, and after that, the Whittams actually sold or gave the property to the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields and the National Park Service. So it's now part of the National Park. And it's one of the prettiest views anywhere you'll see around Cedar Creek. Go ahead. And the marker is no longer there. It's in a private residence for safekeeping because they were afraid it was going to walk away, which it probably would have by now. In 2019, I was able to bring it back out and got this picture about where I remember it being located. The tree that was against gone too, the old cedar tree, but that's approximately where it was. Okay. This is a Google view of the battlefield area we're talking about, and right in there is where the marker would have been, and that's where the picture you saw the soldiers. So it's right in here. Is the marker. Here's 81 crossing Cedar Creek. This line, this is Cedar Creek going around down to the mouth of Cedar Creek in the Shenandoah River. So right here's where Kershaw's men would have crossed Cedar Creek at the low water bridge, and the bridge wasn't there then, and attacked Coburn's 1st Division in this area, while Gordon was coming around and coming in behind him. So the Union Army was facing this way, the rebels came in behind them. Pretty neat trick. Because of the mountain, they saw what was going on. It was, they mapped it. Go ahead. This is a scene today of the same field, closer to the ground. Right there would have been where the marker was. And this is a picture of Massanutten Mountain from about where the marker was placed, looking towards Massanutten Mountain, or Signal Knob. Okay. And there's a view from Signal Knob looking down, and right here is where the marker was. Sorry, I'm a little shaky. I'm not really that shaky, it's just hard to. Maybe. Anyway, I always was curious about who GPM was. And, you know, there was thoughts, well, maybe it's John P. Morgan, you know, it's a Northern Yankee, you know, some Yankee had a lot of money, came down. But anyway, over time, I did a lot of research, went to the Library of Congress, and wherever you could get, try to find names of people who served in the regiments that were in Thoburn's brigade. Most of them are from West Virginia, but there was a Pennsylvania regiment, a New York regiment, a Massachusetts regiment, and some Ohio regiments. So went through thousands of names over whenever I could come across a roster of his regiments, and nothing matched up. There was one fellow named George P. Mott, okay, that lines up, and he was in the 5th New York Cavalry Artillery. Found out he wasn't there though. He'd been wounded at Harper's Ferry in the summer. So, well, maybe it's Confederate. Maybe things were mixed up. It wasn't a Northerner that came down. Maybe it was a Confederate soldier. Couldn't find anything else. It would have been somebody from either Georgia or South Carolina, or one of the regiments in Kershaw's division. Nothing matched up, and you know, it's sort of looking for a needle in a haystack. So finally, one day I said, well, you know, I haven't looked at everybody. Maybe I should look at the artillery. Go ahead. And by the way, if there's a walking trail there, if you haven't been on it, you're allowed to park at the top of the hill and walk through the trails. Shenandoah Valley Battlefields has trail markers there identifying what's going on. And there is some interpretation, but you'll see the trenches, and the old road right here was the longer part of the trench line that was taken out in the 1920s when the State Highway Department decided to put a road down right through the middle of it. But it was a property line, and that's where they put the road. If y'all know Dr. Brill, Dr. Brian Brill, his house is just to the left of this road. And at the end of it is where it makes a sharp turn down towards Cedar Creek. You could park the car, there's interpretive signage there, and you could walk the trails if you ever. Beautiful view. And the Park Service has star parties there, so cut several times a year. So if you're into astronomy, you ought to take advantage of that. Okay. Well, and after the Civil War, about 20 years had passed, and the veterans started coming back, mostly from the North, because it was a Union victory, and the Confederates mostly wanted to forget what happened at Cedar Creek. But in 1885, there was a big reunion in Winchester, and thousands of soldiers came back to Winchester, and they were well welcomed, well received, and they had a lot of speeches, and they shook hands, and things seemed to get better to amend the bitterness. So some of them came to the battles south of Winchester, even to Fisher's Hill. This shows several of them pointing to something that they probably did or they recognized that this would be just on the left, would be just north of Middletown. And then the back was what was called the Dingus Farm, and it's still there. I believe Mrs. Martin and her husband lived there. I don't know if they're still there or not. I know Mr. Martin passed away, but I believe Mrs. Martin still might live in that house. In 1885, Belle Grove also opened up, and they had a big reception at Belle Grove for the people that had come to that reunion in Winchester. Okay. Well, finally, getting back to G.P. Morgan, I found his name finally. I looked at the artillery, and lo and behold, there was George P. Morgan, sergeant, who was wounded at the Battle of Cedar Creek. And he was wounded in the hip. He didn't lose his leg, but he was crippled for the rest of his life. He was lame. And so, well, a lot of diligent research paid off. I was able to identify who that was. But, okay. Not the end of the story, though, because I started researching him. And he'd been a clerk in Philadelphia before the Civil War, before he joined up the 1st Pennsylvania Battery, which, by the way, they had 32 casualties there. 7 of them were killed on that hill and were buried there. And the rest of them were wounded or captured. But he went back after the war, after he recovered from his injury, and to his old job, which was working for a merchant on, I believe it was called Front Street in Philadelphia, which is right along the Delaware River. Very busy place, and as time went on, he became owner of the store and became pretty prominent in Philadelphia. And he joined the Union League, which was started in 1862. That was to support Lincoln and, you know, the policies of Lincoln. And it's still there. There was Union Leagues all over the place at one time. They might have been something like the GAR, Grand Army of the Republic, not to that extent, but they had a lot of veterans in it. And today it's more of a club, a community, you know, civic club, but it's a pretty prominent place, and to be a member of the Union Club in Philadelphia. And I went inside, and it's mahogany and bronze all over the place. Just a wonderful building to go into, and they have a great archives there. So I made an appointment to go to their archives. By the way, there's a lot of, they still remember the Civil War in the North too. There's a lot of monuments. This is General John Reynolds, who was killed at Gettysburg. It's just down the street from the Union Hall, the Union League Hall. Okay. So in the Union League, there's this painting of Sheridan. And I think everybody's heard the poem of Sheridan's Ride by Thomas Buchanan Reed. Well, I didn't know he was an artist as well. He painted that picture. And the original picture's right there. Okay. And then here's this, in the hallway, there's this plaque of all their prestigious members over time. And George P. Morgan's name's on that because he was secretary for a long time. He was also a gold honor member as well. And for some reason, they liked him. I think he must have made some contributions of money, but you know, Abraham Lincoln's on that roll, Dwight D. Eisenhower, and Bob Hope, so he's in good company. But when I'm in the archives, there was this little book. Now, the people there now are not aware of George P. Morgan whatsoever. I said, well, he was secretary here for a number of years in the early 1900s. So they said, oh, okay, we'll see what we have. They brought out this box full of stuff. And one of the things, I mean, he was pretty well celebrated at the time. And there's this little small leather-bound book called the Pilgrim's book. And open it up, and there's these pictures of George P. Morgan and some of the other pilgrims who were veterans of the Union League, and they visited the different battlefields. And they're at Gettysburg right here. It looks like 1903. They were, most of them were members of the Sixth Corps, some of them other Army and Northern Virginia Corps, but most of them had fought in, in Virginia, and the battles here at the Wilderness, and Petersburg in the valley. Okay. Well, here's a picture of Morgan when he comes to Winchester in 1905, and they're sitting at the Methodist church where he was in the hospital after the battle of Cedar Creek after he was wounded. They're sitting at the old Methodist church in Winchester. It's since gone. And he's on the left, and then it's called, can you all see that? I can zoom in if you need to. The fellow in the middle is called the boy. He was a drummer boy, and the fellow on the right sitting down was a major. Now this is 1905. They'd been to the Cedar Creek battlefield for one thing, and visited Winchester battlefields. But what I think is funny, they went back to the church, which was a hospital. Okay. Well, there's a picture of Morgan as a soldier, and I never thought I'd see that. And then here's another picture of him as a member of the Union League in his elder years. He lived to 1926. Okay. And while they were in Winchester, they commandeered a wagon with a horse and filled it full of provisions and went to Cedar Creek. I think in the background there's a buggy, so they all rode to Cedar Creek in this buggy, and they had dinner or a picnic on the way. They called it the commissary wagon. This is all in the book. Go ahead. And then there he is sitting right beside the marker where it was for all those years. Amazing. There's a modern view of it right now. It's just about where the location, I believe, of where he was sitting. So, how often do you come across something like that? Well, Morgan did file, because of his injury, he did file for a pension claim. Now, this is right out of his medical and surgical history of the Civil War. That's not him, but it's on the same page. It shows the type of wound that he sustained at Cedar Creek. It was in the hip and crippling. It was the ball of the femur was shattered. So that's why he walked with a limp all those years. Pretty much was invalid, semi-invalid. Okay. That shows him using a cane. That's him right there, leaning on a cane. So, and I believe that might be the same place, because the whole entourage went down to place the marker. He didn't really know anything about the marker. His friends are the one that had the marker made up in Winchester and placed it there for him. Surprised him. And in the book it describes his experiences at Cedar Creek, and one of the things that happened to him was he fired 6 rounds at the rebels coming up the hill. They shot all the grape shot they had. They fired 2 solid shots, and then they were overrun. But right before that, he and the corporal of the section they were in decided to spike the guns or make them unusable. They ran back to the caissons to get 2 rat tail files to break off in the vent, and they got shot down before they could get back to the cannon. So he said that he laid there all day. He heard the battle fade away to the north, and laid there until close to dark, and he could hear the sounds coming back, the sound of battle coming back, and all the noise down on Route 11. He said early in the morning, when the rebels had overrun the position, that one rebel came up and he had a brand new pair of boots on, and the rebel wrenched it off both legs. Of course, his injured leg, he said he held no malice to any Confederate soldier except that guy. He spent that evening, after the Union Army retook their camps, he was sent back to a barn, you know, for wherever the surgeons were. I guess it could have been the Heater House, which is a barn used as a hospital, but he spent several days in this barn until he was sent to Winchester to, I believe, probably the Sheridan Field Hospital. After that, in January, he was sent to Baltimore to recover, and from there back to Philadelphia to the Satterley Hospital. And he almost died because there was no heat in the train. They were put in a cattle car in the middle of January and sent to Philadelphia. And that's when he almost died. But when we were in my wife and I were in Philadelphia in 2016 looking, you know, researching all this, and we went out to where the location of the Satterley Hospital was on the west end of Philadelphia, and there is a marker where its location is now. It's in a park, but it's mostly a Victorian residential area now. Very pretty place, but at the time of the Civil War, it was West Philadelphia was rural, just open land. So I mentioned that he had a place on Market Street, or Front Street in Philadelphia, and he died in 1926. Morgan was married after the Civil War. They had one daughter. As far as I know, that was the only offspring, and she never married. His daughter died sometime in the 1950s, and so there's no offspring that I'm aware of. Sergeant Morgan. Okay, next. Okay, go back to the mountain now. Just south of Middletown, you'll see the state historical marker. It's entitled Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. And talks about the mountain peak there on Signal Knob. It was called Three Top Mountain during the war, and had a lot of other names, Pittman Point, Three Sisters, a lot of different names for that. But by this marker, it says that there's a soldier still buried there. Well, I always wanted to know, where is it? You know, where is his grave? Well, I had a neighbor, his name was Dick Davison, and he said he knew where it was. He was older generation. I think he was born in 1912, 1915, and he roamed those mountains. He grew up right at the base of the mountain, and he knew it like the back of his hand, and he said he knew where the grave was. So he told me, and I went up there, 3 or 4 times. I'd always try to make a trip to the top of the mountain at least once a year, and not so often, not frequently lately, but I never could find it. He said that it was a rock pile off the trail, on the right side of the trail, and it had a burnt post there. I never could find it. Well, Dick died in, I believe it was 1996, and well, that's that. But about 10 years later, his daughter said, Mike, she said, I found this picture that Daddy took of the gravesite on the mountain. And I looked at it. I'll get to that in a minute. This is the view from Signal Knob on the valley floor. And as you can see, the view's changing quite a bit from what it used to be. A lot of commercial and industrial growth and residential growth along the Route 11 corridor. And this is in Frederick County. From up there, the views of the quarry are pretty evident. Also on top of Signal Knob are fortifications. They're in the thickets. And there's 8 or 10 of these rock barricades up there. Mapped most of them, and they were 12 feet long and 2 or 3 feet high. And they just would pick up the boulders that were handy and they were used by both sides. You can see how thick that ground is up there, Mount Laurel and Bramble. Okay. Over the side of the hill is a rock shelter They made, piled up stones right there and used the shelter to get away from the wind in the wintertime. This would probably be the signalmen that were up there. Several occasions, several years they used that all through the war. Whoever was in control of the valley used Signal Knob as a signal station. And there's one of the paths that lead up to where I'm going to show you next. Go ahead. So anyway, this picture, and this is not the same picture. I noticed in the background the shape of the mountain right there. The next mountain is the angle of it. And I knew you couldn't see that from the point of Signal Knob. So I walked up that path you saw in the preceding picture. I started walking up that path until I got to a point where that angle matched up with the picture. And I looked to the right, and there's this pile of stones. And there's a closer up view. Now the post is no longer there. The original picture showed a burnt post, but that's no longer there. But I believe that's the grave of the soldier that's mentioned in the marker on Route 11. The only way, one way to find out, it's National Forest Service property. Archaeology would tell that, but it pretty much fits, particularly with the old history, the old lore that was a grave site, that somebody knew it was a grave site. So I think we found it, and it's sort of interesting to me, using the slope of the mountain to pinpoint it. But it's not on top of the mountain, at the point. Go ahead. It's, I'll zoom in here. It's actually 3/4 of a mile back from the point of the mountain. The trail that goes over to Fort Valley. I was always looking on the other trail that went down to what's called Sand Springs or the Strasburg Reservoir, so I was completely off. But it's right where the turn of the trail is. It goes out to Monica Peak, and it takes you over to Fort Valley on the trail that comes out close to Elizabeth Burns. And this picture was taken from Long Meadows. On the right, there's a poem that was written shortly after the Battle of Cedar Creek. I guess in December of 1864, when the 12th West Virginia and Sheridan's Army had moved back to Camp Russell north of Stevens City along the Opecon line. And this poem was written. I can pass out some copies if somebody's interested to take it home with them. I made a few copies. And I'm not going to read it, but the men thought enough of Sergeant Goodwin, who was killed up there. Memorializing in a poem. Now, what happened? Goodwin, his body was never found. He was killed on August 14th, 1864, on Signal Knob, trying to capture and hold the signal station. There were several men in his regiment with him. There's one of them they thought was killed, but he turned up as a more missing in action. He died in federal prison, or Confederate prison in Salisbury, North Carolina. That 62 men went up the mountain from the 12th West Virginia that hot August day to take control of the station. One of them being a Lieutenant Pritchard, who was in command. And he wrote about it after the war. He talks about how he lost his watch up there, which was also found years later. And there's some interesting stories you can pick up reading post-war newspapers. But he talks about Sergeant Goodwin being killed on the mountain and one other man in that regiment. Well, it wasn't long before the early sent Confederates to recapture Signal Knob, which they did that afternoon after a short skirmish. And the Union soldiers were probably fighting from those rock barricades. they were chased to the bottom of the mountain. Well, Sheridan didn't like that. He said, I want to take control of the mountain because of what happened on October 19th. It was evidently a very important place for the Confederates to have control of, and for the Yankees also to keep control of, which they didn't. So the next day, August 15th, he sent 2 regiments up that mountain early in the morning, and if you read the history of the 116th Ohio, they talk about what a hot day it was, and they were so hot that they drank water out of the mud puddles from the rain the evening before. That's how thirsty they got. I couldn't imagine going up. They went up twice that day, and along with the 14th Pennsylvania, 14th West Virginia Regiment. He seems like Sheridan sent the West Virginia boys to take the mountains for some reason. But okay, go ahead. There's 2 men killed on August 15th in the 14th West Virginia Regiment. Thomas Mason and William McCulloch were both killed on Signal Knob that day, and they were buried together. In 1885, they were the last 2 interments at the National Cemetery, so that I'm aware of. I haven't seen any Civil War soldiers being buried there since 1885. So they found the 2 graves, but they never found the 3rd grave, which I believe is a good one. Supposition now. Go ahead. Here's another supposition. This is fact though, General Bidwell, Daniel Bidwell, commander of the 3rd Brigade, 2nd Brigade, 3rd Brigade, 2nd Division, Getty's, of the 6th Corps, was killed over here or mortally wounded at Mount Hebron Cemetery about 9:30 in the morning on October 19th. And I've been to try to get some more information about him. I've been to Buffalo, and there's statues all over Buffalo of Bidwell. The street's named after Bidwell. He was city chief of police before the Civil War and raised the 49th New York Regiment. Go ahead. And the 2nd Division, or Getty's Division of the 6th Corps, pretty much held off the entire Confederate Army for an hour or more, while the rest of the Union Army retreated a mile north of Middletown and were able to group together and have a defensive line there that when Sheridan finally arrived around 10:30 in the morning. So the 6th Corps always sort of lords this over the other corps that ran that morning supposedly, and the other divisions of the 6th Corps, because the 2nd Division made the stand. It's essentially turned the rebel tide, or turned the tide of battle. This picture, it's a signage at the cemetery. Did I say Mount Hebron? Well, I meant Mount Carmel Cemetery, or the Middletown Cemetery. This is photographed by Keith Rocco, and it's on the signage over there. It describes what happened, and shows General Bidwell being attended to behind a stone wall. Oh, damn. Right here. And I think there was no stone wall there during the battle, but there is reference to a stone wall where the fight had occurred later on, the next place they fell back to. And this is Knight's Battery firing at the Confederate soldiers charging up the hill. Once the 2 attacks were fought back, 2 attacks by the Confederates, General Early decided to shell the bejesus out of that ridge over there, and Confederate artillery was lined up along Route 11 south of town. And this might be a half mile at the most distance to that ridge, easy range of the cannons. So they threw in hundreds of shells in there. Bidwell told his men to lie down behind the crest of the hill for protection. And one shell landed right in the middle of a group of his men, killing a number of them. The second shell came down. He was sitting on his horse. He told everybody else to lay down, but he and his adjutant didn't. They were on their horse, you know, like Stonewall at the First Manassas. And shell cannonball came in, exploded over his head, took off part of his shoulder. Pretty serious wound, killed him. Within a few hours, he died. From that mortal wound. His adjutant, his name was George Orr, was also wounded. He lost his arm, but not his life. Orr wrote later that he was taken back to a house behind the Union lines, and I was along with Bidwell, and that's where Bidwell died. His last words, I hope I did my duty, or I tried to do my duty. I'd say that he did. His brother was Frederick Bidwell. He was a captain in the 49th New York Volunteers. He wasn't present at the Battle of Cedar Creek. He'd been wounded a month earlier at Winchester. In 1912, he wrote a history of the 49th New York, which, like I said, was mostly out of the Buffalo area. Well, I'm looking for the rosters of men who were casualties in that battle, and I'm reading his book, and he came to an 1890 dedication of a marker to General David Russell at the Winchester National Cemetery. He was leader of I believe one of the divisions of the 6th Corps, 1st Division, I believe. But he was killed at the 3rd Battle of Winchester, and in 1890 they dedicated a monument to him at the National Cemetery. And a lot of Union soldiers in the 6th Corps came to that, Frederick Bidwell being one of them. And then after that was over, the next few days they went to the different battlefields. When they're here at Middletown, Bidwell asked General Getty, who was also present, if he knew where his brother, General Bidwell, had been killed. And he said, I could take you to the place right now. It's about a mile from here. It's marked by a large boulder. Digressed a little bit from that. Okay, this is an 1884 picture of what is called at the bottom is described as Cemetery Ridge. And I believe right there, you can see it, is Mount Carmel Cemetery. It's surrounded by a wooden fence. And the lay of the land looks different in this view because they're using a wide angle lens, so you can't see the exaggerated steepness of the hills, and it doesn't really match up, except right here are the rocks. And these rocks are still evident if you're looking just south of where Schaefer's barbecue is now. These rocks are still there. Schaefer's barbecue would be right here. And you can, from that position, you can see cemetery, or Mount Carmel Cemetery really easy if the trees weren't there. To the right of this picture, and by the way, this was taken by two brothers called Thomas Biscoe and I forget the other one's name, but there's two brothers that were traveling up and down the valley in 1885 or 1884 taking pictures of battle sites. You'll notice there's a crest of a hill that dips down and then goes in a northerly direction. Well, if you were at Schaefer's barbecue, and Butch would be very familiar with this place, he parked the Union, participants in that field there all the time. It veers to the north, and the description talks about the two houses at the beginning of Middletown. So I'm pretty certain that's the location of this picture. So this is a view on the left of the cemetery looking to the southeast. Signal knobs in the background. It's almost the same setting as in the picture that you saw by Rocco. And this is a picture looking up the hill as the Confederates would attack. They got within 30 yards twice of the Union soldiers there and were beaten back. The artillery, a third attack was made as well, and it was also aborted, but the artillery finally forced the Union soldiers off the hill and back to about a mile north of Middletown. But right here is the crest of the hill. Go ahead. So I asked Joe Whitehorn, I said, Joe, did you ever hear anything about a stone or a marker to General Bidwell? He said, Cedar Creek is, no, I'm not familiar with it. And I told him a little bit about what I'd read, and he says, well, if there's one there, look on the north end of the cemetery. So one day I'm driving around the cemetery and I stop and I look over, there's this unusual stone there. That's it. And what's the second picture, I'll zoom in just a little bit. I don't know if there's any relatives of Jack Kiley here tonight or not, but Jack was a long-term resident of Middletown. And in 2017, when I came across this rock, Jack had his marker out there already in place. He's ready for that day. It only had one date on it for him. And I said, Jack, there's a funny-looking stone out in front of where your marker is. And by the way, he was one of the trustees of the cemetery. He says, I don't know. It's always been there. He says, somebody's buried there, I would guess. We don't know who it is. But next time I went there, I saw Jack passed away in 2019, so he has 2 dates now on that marker. His wife's still alive, doing well, I hope. Anyway, no one seems to have a record of this stone. Next slide. And last year, a friend of mine named Mark Ludlow, he's an archaeologist, has ground penetrating radar. We got permission to check around that stone. And lo and behold, there's nothing there. No one's buried there. If somebody was, this is a slice of the subterranean soil. If there was a grave there, you would see more of a V shape cut out. And this is just a strata, natural strata going across. So nope, that ground's not been disturbed. Just to make sure, we did check out some of the close by graves there, and they're evident. So I think that's where Bidwell was killed or mortally wounded. I think the boulder was that rock we were looking at. It was probably bigger. It's real jagged at the top, so it was probably broken off at some point since the Civil War. Maybe a tree broke it off. But I do believe that's General Bidwell's marker, which is not unusual, because most battlefields that you go to, they know where their prominent officers were killed or wounded. Most battlefields have those. The veterans did that when they came back. They marked these places. Or they may have done it right after the battle. Okay. Another monument. This is south of there. It's on Belgrove property now. It's along the trench lines. And it's a pile of rocks. Okay. For many years, we thought it was just where a field. Stones have been carried out of fields, by clearing by the farmers. But the only thing, it's limestone rock. These are all limestone rock. The rocks out in the fields are cobbles or quartzite, slate. They're not particularly limestone in that particular area. So these rocks were carried in from somewhere else. 2016, I took this picture, and it was fairly clear then. In 2021, last fall, it was getting rather overgrown. So it's right behind the trenches on the highest part of the 19th Corps defensive line. Go ahead. Well, Francis Buffum was another veteran that came back in 1885, and he writes in his history of the 14th New Hampshire, he calls the title of his book Sheridan's Veterans. He talks about coming first to the battlefield in 1882, back to Cedar Creek, and he piled up some stones at the highest point and that's where the 14th New Hampshire was. And then in 1885, they attended the big reunion in Winchester, and he said he looked out, he came back to the site, he said he looked out over the fields and he said that you could see soldiers walking everywhere. It was almost like at the battle, during the battle. But he describes several other soldiers, or his compatriots in the 14th New Hampshire came back, and he said that even though the Vermont monument was dedicated that year and called the first monument at Cedar Creek, he said he did it in 1882. He put up the first monument. So they reinforced it. They put up a pile of stones 5 feet high and 3 feet, a 3-foot base. So I imagine it was pyramid shaped or round shaped. Anyway, they left some information there in a tin can and some other mementos, and they said a cornerstone, something ensconced on a cornerstone. I believe that's what that pile of rocks is. And something else, it's at the highest point, go to the next picture, along the 19th Corps lines. I can zoom in more if you'd like, but that's Bell Grove in the distance there. And this is Route 11, that's where Cedar Creek Battlefield headquarters is, right there. So it's a pretty high elevation, probably 3/4 of a mile from each, maybe closer to a mile. I'll add to it here a little bit on something else, digress. When I was 14, 15 years old, Roland Fisher owned this property, and they plowed these fields for the first time that I could remember. And so I said, well, I'll go see what I can find. I'm walking along the roads, and I found bullets, buttons out there. I remember finding a New York button. And one place, there was charcoal had been turned up, and there were some buttons there. And, you know, it still hadn't been discs. It was still rough clods. And I see the stick over there, and I want something steady, and I walk over to the musket barrel. So that would be right in this low area right here. So they camped all through here. It's only been plowed that I remember once since then. Anyway, going back to my old friend Dick Davison, who used to metal detect over there quite a bit, he found a dog tag or an ID tag to a soldier in the 14th New Hampshire Regiment. His name was Charles McMahon. He was from Charleston, I think, New Hampshire. And I asked him one time, I said, where'd you get it? And he says, near that old cabin up there along the trenches. Well, there's the remnants of a cabin. It's made out of cedar saplings. And I understand that the Brumback boys, which would be Malcolm and Clyde, made that when they were youngsters. It's about gone now, but anyway, that's pretty close to that rock pile. So that puts the 14th New Hampshire right there. And that rock pile, I believe, is what the soldiers put up in 1885. Okay. Here's some other rocks, unusual rocks that I've discovered out in the woods. At the north end of the trench line, where just showed you the 14th New York was, or the 14th New Hampshire was, there's this rectangular rock against a tree right there. And the tree's not that old, but that rock, it's grown into the stone has grown into it a little bit, or the tree's grown around the stone somewhat. So it's still there. It was hard to get a picture of it because it was one of those hedge apple trees, a lot of thorns. I had to get down, and it was hard to get a really good picture. Not far away, going in the other direction, is this other stone along the fence line. And it's similarly shaped. Now both these stones were in the area where Stephen Thomas's brigade camped. They were into the, I forget, it was second division. I believe they were in the second division. And they were on the right flank of the second division of the 19th Corps in the trench line. So both these stones are fairly close to where they would have camped, the 8th Vermont being one of the regiments in that brigade. Let me zoom in just so you can see a little bit better. That's the one that's in line with the trench line. The one to the right is also in a fence line, but it's just unusual. It may just be a field stone, but it's the way it's shaped and the way where it's put right there in the fence line. I would think it's probably been placed there purposely and not a field rubble. And then down at the bottom picture is across Route 11 in what I call the 8th Vermont Woods. It's south of where the 8th Vermont Monument is. There's this marker right here at the base of this tree, and it's definitely been put there because you don't find limestone rock on the east side of Route 11. It's all shale ground. Any limestone rock has been brought in. This rock almost has the same dimensions as Morgan stone. Now it's a limestone rock, field stone, but it's been shaped, it was put there by somebody. So could be Thomas's brigade, might be where they fought. Maybe the 8th Vermont was at both locations, or one of the other regiments. Okay. This won't be much longer if, we can take a break if you want to, but should wrap it up in about 15 minutes. A couple of others, they're not markers or monuments, but these are things that you can still see on the battlefield. This is the old Orndorff property where the reenactment fields are held now. We call it the Heater property now, or Heater Fields. Cedar Creek Battlefield Foundation owns this land. In the back is tent sites. You can still see it when the grass is low, and the snow in particular outlines it. But there's a series of tent sites back there. This particular hill was never plowed. It was the woods during the Civil War. In fact, the last tree on that hill just died in the past year or so. Remember the tree over the side of the hill? It's gone. Well, it's still there, but it's dead. This is my brother Pat. We found this other feature out there, and it's not a sinkhole. It's man-made. There's some grave sites out there as well. You could see them because the ground has not been plowed that much. For instance, on the right, and you may not be able to see it very well, but see this ditch? It's about 8 feet long, 4 feet wide. It was probably a grave site at one time. After the Civil War, the Union Army hired contractors to come back out and reinter whatever remains they could find back to the National Cemetery, or if it was Confederates, to the Stonewall Cemetery in Winchester. So they removed most of the soldiers that were buried on these battlefields around the area, but they didn't backfill the holes. There's numerous places that I've seen people say they're tree falls. They're not tree falls because tree falls are circular or semicircular in shape. This is digital or straight line. They're not latrines either because they're too wide. Latrines are they're pretty narrow. You didn't want to straddle a latrine if it's 4 feet wide. But yeah, there's evidence of this still out there on all the battlefields. To the left of my brother again, this is over closer to, this property is owned by Shenandoah Valley Battlefields. I believe somebody's buried there. It's a mound that's been thrown on dirt from both sides. It's about 8 or 10 feet long and about 3 feet wide, so it's not a tree fall. And it's not far from where Kershaw crossed the Cedar Creek that day, and where some of the pickets were for the 5th New York Regiment that was out on picket that morning. Both those guys were captured as well, just like the 128th New York Regiment. But they did have a few casualties. One they never found. One soldier was never found. Don't know. Not everything that you come across is out in the field, is not visual and three-dimensional. Sometimes you find things in books. And looking through Taylor's sketchbook, I think most of you are probably familiar with it. James E. Taylor was a sketch artist with the New York Illustrated News. And he accompanied Sheridan's army. And after the war, he drew sketches, as closest we have to photographs, actual photographs of the day of battle. Because after the war, he finished the sketches that he did and drew pictures similar to this one. And he published it recently, 20 years ago. It was published in a book. If you come across a book like this, get it, because they're very rare. Not only did he draw the pictures, but he described what he saw, what he was doing. So the day after the Battle of Cedar Creek, he gets up early and he comes across a scene, and it would be just north of Middletown on the east side of the highway. He says, effects of a shell of battery M.U.S. artillery 6 core. Well, that would have been McKnight's battery. It's probably more DuPont's battery, which was in the 8th Corps. But in the description, he talks about 5 rebel soldiers being killed by 1 artillery shell. And they were hiding in a hollow. They thought they would be a little safer there, and the shell apparently found them out. And anyway, there's 5 soldiers. By the way, he draws himself in the sketch. He's on horseback drawing the scene. And in the background, you'll see a barn and the back of a house. So that sort of adds to the location along with his description. To the right are 4 soldiers that were killed by the same shell at Cedar Creek. So they were all in the, it's called, Phillips Georgia Legion, and they were part of Kershaw's brigade, but they had been separated from the rest of Kershaw's division. I mean, they had been separated early in the morning, and they wound up north of Middletown with Ramseur's and Wharton's division. And for a while, they were on the east or the west side of the Pike, and then they were moved over to closer to where 81 now is. So, in all the research I've done, I cannot find of the casualties at Cedar Creek and on the Confederate side, I cannot find where anybody had multiple KIAs except in this regiment. There's Georgia Legion. So now there's 5 guys there and that are dead. That doesn't match, but this is probably why they moved away to the west side or east side of the Pike. Anyway, that could be the 4 soldiers that are named right there. It's funny how you can sometimes match up things to pictures. Okay. And I mentioned a minute ago the house. There's the barn. This is a view from about where Lord Fairfax College is, with General Charles Lowell making a charge, and shows him this is just. He didn't see this happen. He's just doing it from what he memorialized Lowell. Lowell was shot from the Brinker House, which is just about where the pizza shop is now. The not Handy Mart, the Italian Touch. I believe that's where the house was, or in that close proximity. There's the barn, and the scene that he sketched would be down behind that barn. And so, if I'm correct, it would be down closer to those apartments, on the east side of the Italian, or west side of the Italian Touch, somewhere in that area. this building here is Wayside Inn, and there's what was called the toll house, and that's some little barn or shed. So that's approximately the area where that scene was. Go ahead. The next day, the same day, he wanders on further down and starts following Meadowbrook Run. And he actually, I thought for a long time he'd followed it to the, Nick corrected me on that. I thought he turned downstream, but he went upstream and then over country. And he came across this scene of two soldiers dead underneath the tree. There was a soldier, a wounded Confederate soldier still there, and he told him that they were two brothers that had died there the day before. I didn't know this, but my wife Kathy pointed this out to me last night. She said, you know, did they die with their hands up in the air like that? Well, yeah. The next day would have been rigor mortis. But sort of a gruesome picture, but on the other hand, it's pretty touching as well. Two brothers. Okay. This is Hotchkiss's map of the Battle of Cedar Creek. By the way, Middletown's right here. Middletown. This, where the Sibley tents were, that's the heater house. And that shows there was woods there during the Civil War. Behind the heater house, that was woods. But anyway, getting back to this last scene, Taylor goes down to the mill and then sort of makes a circuitous route. And right here, it says Evans Brigade, right here in this area. So they were fighting the 19th Corps. Then he leaves there and he goes to Buffalo Marsh Run or Middle Marsh Run. He waters his horse, then he continues coming down, heads towards the Valley Pike, and he's sketching scenes along the way, and they're in the book, and until he gets to Bell Grove. And then I guess that took all day because there's no more scenes that particular day, but day after the battle scene. But what's interesting is the next slide. Before Taylor got there, the evening before, this lieutenant, sorry it's cut off, can't help you there. His name was LaGrange Severance of the 12th Maine. Are you familiar with him, Nick? Nick knows all about Maine soldiers. They won the Civil War, by the way. LaGrange Severance came across the same scene that Taylor saw the previous morning, the next morning. Only one of the brothers was still alive. So he was able to get some information from the one brother who turned out to be the youngest one. And the youngest brother knew that his brother died, and he knew he didn't have long for this world, so he asked this Yankee lieutenant to write his parents after the war was over and let him know what happened to him. And so time passed, and Severance, I'll pass this out as well. This is a letter that he wrote in 1866 to the two brother soldiers. They lived in Brooks County or Quitman, Georgia. And it was August 1866. He wrote and explained what happened. And he said he never went back to the location to find out whether or not the one soldier, the younger brother, died or not. He said he just didn't have time and couldn't get back there. But he did let the parents of the two brothers know that they died, perished at Cedar Creek. Now, we don't know where they're buried now. Severance said that he wrote the name of the soldiers and left it pinned to their blankets. But they were probably buried on site, and then after the war, after the battle, somebody, probably the locals, buried them. They may have seen the name, maybe they didn't, maybe it was put on a wooden marker or post. But anyway, several years before these bodies were moved to probably Stonewall Cemetery, And by that time, a lot of identifications had already disappeared. Maybe they'd even used them for firewood. You know, you see that, I've read that in a lot of cases where they had wooden markers and the opposing army would camp on the same ground and they'd burn them up for firewood. So that happened a lot. Anyway, the two brothers are probably buried in Winchester as unknowns. There's a section of the Stonewall Cemetery that was for the soldiers that were removed from Cedar Creek. It's like 100-some soldiers buried there from Cedar Creek. And the rest of them are probably buried at Strasburg Presbyterian Church in Strasburg, another cemetery. And there's probably still some soldiers still out there. Anyway, I had given I belonged to the Sons of Confederate Veterans camp in Strasburg, and a couple of years ago I gave a talk to them before COVID about Taylor's sketchbook, because I've been trying, you know, identify not only here but some other soldiers from Fisher's Hill using the file, the database I have of soldiers' names. You could sort of get close sometimes on who these people may be. I think on this I'm pretty 100% on these two guys, but the next day I volunteered for the Park Service. It was weird. Strange to get emotional about this a little bit. The next day, I went to the Park Service, volunteered, and they said, "You got to be kidding me!" I told them about the, the two soldiers, showed them the sketch, and they said, "Some people from Georgia just came in yesterday." That's it. Thank you.
Shall I start? Good afternoon.
It's on. You just need to talk.
Good afternoon. It is. Good afternoon. Hi.